Hey, so in the last section, we created a modal right here, and we talked about that it's really not a very good way of doing modals, is it? So now I want to talk to you about a really big issue that we probably would encounter at some point in the future. So remember, this modal right here is always going to be deeply nested inside of our application. We might have a tremendous amount of JSX with a ton of styling parents to that modal component. So this modal is going to be wrapped by maybe two or even three divs inside of the about component, or maybe even another div inside the app. And every one of those divs can have a certain amount of styling being applied to it. So let me just quickly show you what I mean. I'm going to go back over to my editor and I'm going to wrap my modal element right here with a new div. And I'm going to give that div a class of wrapper, and then I'll add in a selector for it inside my CSS file. And I'm going to say that the position is relative and the z-index is 0. So I'm going to save all this, and I'm going to flip back to the browser. And now we're back to the previous case. The About card appearing on top of the screen. So wait a minute now, why is that, you might ask? Notice that we still have the modal right here with a z-index of 10, which is higher than the About card, which has a z-index of essentially undefined. So let's take a look at a diagram and understand why we're seeing the About card on top. So we have our body element at the very top. We have the About card with the z-index of undefined. And we now have something called the wrapper element right here that has position of relative and z-index of 0. And as a child to it, our modal with a z-index of 10. So you see, here's the issue. Whenever we place a div with a position of relative and a z-index of, well, some defined value, even if it is 0, it creates something called a stacking context. Now, there are many different ways to create a stacking context. We now created a stacking context by using a position of relative and a z-index of 0. But that's just one of the many ways of doing this. When we create a stacking context, it essentially creates a new way of comparing different sibling elements that have assigned z-index values that might want to be rendered on top of each other. So essentially, when we create this stacking context right here, we're no longer comparing the About card's z-index with the modal's z-index. No, instead, we are comparing these About cards with the stacking context that contains the modal. Ouch. So in our case, it's the About card with a z-index of undefined against the wrapper element with a z-index of 0. And in this particular case, the About card effectively wins. You can see that the indexes are about the same, but the About card element occurs later. So then the About card is written out. So if there is an element listed later on the inside of the body element, if the indexes are the same, then whichever element occurs later will be the one that's displayed on top of the other. So that's why the About card is now being displayed on top, because we are creating this new stacking context. Okay, so you're probably thinking, hey, well, you know what? Now that I get it, it's probably pretty easy to fix. You might think that you want to take out this div with a class of wrapper and change the z-index to 100, and now that's going to definitely beat out the About card. And yeah, that's pretty good thinking, but here's the issue. So remember, when we have a React application, we've got all of these different divs, all these different elements, all these different components, and all our modals might be deeply nested inside of this div with ID of root. So at some point in time in the future, you might work on an application that already has hundreds of components inside it. And let's say you might have a super deeply nested component structure. And so it's not always going to be quite so easy for you to just say, I just need to change some parent CSS, because there's always going to be a possibility if you change it, you might break the entire application. So that's why it's not always such a good solution to change the Z index. But instead of doing that, we're going to follow a little different way to fix it, and follow along. I'll show you what I mean. So here's what we're going to do first. Rather than showing our modal as a child of the wrapper, we're going to instead show the modal as a child of the body. Now remember this diagram right here? Let's go to the diagram. So this is essentially how we have to put the React applications together. So rather than follow the normal rules of React, where we nest all of our components underneath of each other, we're going to do this by using React portals. So we don't have to stick with this type of component hierarchy where everything is a child of the ID root. Instead, we try to render the modal component as a child of some other element inside of our HTML body element. So that's why the React portal is absolutely important, and that's pretty much what it does. Okay? So again, we would like to do this to get around all of the rules of stacking context or some CSS issues that you're definitely going to run into. So what do? Make use of portals. Cool. Let's take a break right here, and when we come back, I'm going to show you how we create a React portal.